Episode 2, Childeric et Clovis. In the middle of the 17th century, not far from a church in Tournai, in modern-day Belgique, one built in the 12th century and dedicated to Saint Brice, a great find was made by accident. That of a tomb containing a great deal of treasures, gold, and jewels, which included 300 golden beads, the Merovingian symbol for divine potency. But the greatest finds would be the corpse of a man buried with his horse and with a ring, with the inscription reading, Childeric Regis. Childeric, the king. This king said to be the son of the semi-mythical Meroving, whom it was claimed was himself the son of a sea god of some sort, was a king of the 5th century, the age when the Western Roman Empire was finishing its final cataclysmic fall. Childeric was one of these hired chieftains, who succeeded his father to the position of head of a tribe of Salian Franc after his father Meroving's death around the time of 457 or 458. Acknowledged in this position by the local Roman leaders, he would then serve them militarily in return for being settled upon the lands of Tournai, north of the Seine, which became attached to his people. Childeric, though, soon ran afoul of local Roman magistrates, according to Grégoire de Toul, our primary source for the period, possibly of the Roman warlord Aegidius, who was intent upon accruing as much power in Gaul as possible in preparation to wage war against his rival Ricimer, with Childeric, for his part, having been marrying one too many wives in an obvious attempt to forge as many alliances as possible, until he could no longer afford to support. This served to irritate the local Franc, though, as it was customary for a man to be able to support his wives, something that Childeric possibly couldn't do. Therefore, for what was possibly a mixture of personal exasperation and political machinations, he was cast out and exiled to Thuringe, in what is now the center of modern-day Germany. Aegidius, though, assumed the office of King de Franc to solidify his own power, a wise move that likely wouldn't have been tolerated centuries prior by the Ramais. With that said, it availed him nothing, as he was soon assassinated in his own camp around the year 464 or 465. As to Childeric, while in Thuringe, he humorously spent some time with Ruparien Franc, where he seduced his host's wife and Queen Basin, an ambitious woman who favored her lover due to him being more charismatic, and possibly more powerful in the long term than her current husband was. Having split a coin in half before his departure, and left one half with an old friend, one who held on to it during this period of banishment, this friend would send his half to Childeric after Aegidius' fall. The Franc had in the meantime grown frustrated with Franc, and were easily persuaded via their exiled chief's followers to request his return, which he did after perhaps 8 years of exile. Upon his return with his new wife Basin and their son Clovis, he resumed his kingship. Likely, he would have expanded southwards, but he was contained in the north by Syagrius, who had taken up Aegidius' position as the Roman commander in Gaul, with his center of power, like his predecessor, being Soissons. Childeric, while a competent commander if the records are to be trusted, few as they are on this time period, was succeeded by Clovis, a precocious and even more brilliant commander who had a natural charisma and knack for inspiring passionate loyalty in those around him. As charming as his father and as fickle in his loyalties as his mother, he was well equipped to not only survive, but to thrive in the dangerous years after the fall of the empire. An incredibly ruthless, if super competent monarch. Clovis was elevated to his father's post in what you must understand was in that era a less than certain affair, because kingship in that era was not a top-down affair, but an almost democratic thing, as kings were but tribal chieftains who were the best men for the job of leading their fellow tribesmen, who duly elected them. What is more is that at that time, there were no formal borders in what is now France and Belgique. Instead, what we find is a collection of tribes, each living in different, sometimes overlapping areas of the Gallic province. This was a messy affair, a disorganized mess where it was likely more organized in the time of the Pax Romana. Under Clovis, this would change, but that will come later. At 15 years old, the age of adulthood for young men of that period, he succeeded his father. Clovis didn't behave impulsively, as many young men of today likely would. Instead, he settled into the business of preparing a series of alliances, what some might call a kind of triumvirate alliance between him and the Franc of Ragnachal, leader of those in Cambrai, and Clovis' cousin, Childeric, so that they dominated the north. In 486, this alliance was put to the test, when it marched against Syagrius, who met them in Soissons, where Childeric refused to fight against the Roman commander. This wasn't enough to stop the other two, though, from scoring a decisive victory. Syagrius soon fled the battle for the court of the Visigothic king Alaric II in Toulouse, with Syagrius soon imprisoned before he was surrendered to Clovis, in a gesture intended to win them a friendly neighbor. The Goths wanted nothing to do with this war, whilst Syagrius' descendants for their part, fled for the Byzantine Empire. After the battle, Clovis pillaged and plundered the area in order to please his men, as commanders were responsible to their men, whom had to be satisfied lest they switch loyalties to another possible chieftain. A keen politician, Clovis could see the value of the southern towns and culture, which was why he soon sought to establish cordial relations with the local Christian culture. This was why, when the Bishop of Rheims made overtures and wished to have a vase, he talked to Clovis, who then tried to convince the soldier who had looted the church that held the vase. The soldier refused to do so, and in disobedience of his commander, smashed it. Booty was supposed to be divided amongst the Franks, among all the warriors of the warband. To return it was thus apparently out of the question. However, Clovis was not a man you denied lightly. A year later, in what can only be said to be a demonstration of his cunning and patience, he announced that he intended to suddenly inspect everyone's kits. Coming up to the warrior from the year prior, he examined his shield and weapons, only to toss them to the ground. When the unfortunate man bent down to pick them up, the son of Childeric hefted up his own axe and sank it into the man's skull, saying, "As you did to the vase of Soissons." Stories such as these illustrate the ruthlessness, not only of the king, but of the times. The conquest of the area around Soissons, meanwhile, was not an open and closed deal. You see, it took time to absorb land into one's own domain, with the siege of Verdun, for example, taking up several years. Just as his father had done, Clovis had maintained ties with his mother's people of Thuringe, and settled some of the people in his new lands to help secure them. He also saw to the business of securing peace with some possibly useful allies. Since the Ostrogoths of Italy, whom were under the command of Childeric the Great, he married one of his sisters to him, in order to further surround Bourgogne and Toulouse, which gave him breathing room, along with a future ally in any invasion of the south. While Clovis was placating his people and new subjects, so to speak, events in Bourgogne, to the east of his borders, had exploded, with the primary king of the area having been assassinated by his own brother, Gondebaud, who sought to claim his brother's inheritance as his own. Brutally drowning his sister-in-law, he then forced one of her daughters into a convent, and tried to do the same to another daughter. Yet she would escape to Godé-Giselle, another one of her uncles. This put him in an impossible situation. What was he to do? He soon acted fast, though, by marrying Clotilde, his niece, to Clovis. He thus evaded immediate problems, whilst empowering himself at the same time. With this alliance, he guaranteed support against his rival and protected his rear from attack. What this also served the useful purpose of, at least for many of the people of Clovis's domain, was to supply him with a Catholic wife, one who would work tirelessly to convert her not unwilling husband over the next few years. Her efforts soon paid off, as dramatically, during a battle with Allemands, or Alemanni, tribesmen near Tolbiac, near Cologne, in 496, or possibly the later date of 406, when the final victory over Tolbiac and the Allemands was concluded. Clovis, who had always maintained as a condition for conversion that he be granted victory in battle by his wife's foreign god, in a moment of difficulty he prayed to him, secured victory, and celebrated his victory afterwards with thousands of his people, and received the baptism and thus converted to Christianity. Distracting him from his feud with the Allemands in the year 500 was the renewed problem of the civil war of Bourgogne between Gondebaud and Godé-Giselle, who had decided to openly wage war with Gondebaud, who was beaten by the combined army, fled to Avignon, whilst Godé-Giselle retired to Vienna, leaving the pursuit and siege to Clovis, who was soon bribed after several months with an annual tribute. A wise move, as it avoided tying up his forces any longer in what was rapidly becoming obvious wasn't his war, but that of Godé-Giselle. Wars of the 5th and 6th centuries weren't fought for the benefit of others, but for oneself. And should you forget that lesson, as Godé-Giselle soon did, you merited your fall. This was something that Clovis knew very well. As to Godé-Giselle, he was defeated and killed in Vienne, along with most of his family. His granddaughters would later serve as brides for Clovis's sons, so we'll come back to them in the next episode. For the next 3 years, after having abandoned Godé-Giselle, Clovis raided the region of Bretagne, only to come to negotiate with them. The Bretons agreed to an alliance against the Visigoths, as they both hated them so much, more than each other. Thus, the next big event in this bloody reign was, of course, the spilling of yet more blood. You likely know, given how Clovis was expanding in every direction that he possibly could find, who his next targets will be. By now, his realm had come to fill out perhaps the entirety of the Nord de Gaule. Therefore, he only had southwards to go from here. Marching south against the Visigoths, with what is now a rather diverse army of Ripuariens and Salians, Francs, Armoricains of Bretagne, and the Romains of the Soissons region, Clovis clashed with Alaric II, the king of the Ostrogoths of Toulouse, who had tried to placate him almost 20 years prior at Vouillers. The current battle took place in 507. It is said that Clovis even killed Alaric by his own hand in the battle. The battle concluded in Clovis's favor, and saw his realm extended far to the south and put an end to Visigothic ambitions in Aquitaine, which was mostly added to Clovis's domain. The rewards didn't end there. He was nominated a suffect consul by the Byzantine emperor Anastase, or Anastasius I, for the year of possibly 508, a huge boon politically. He soon dressed in a purple tunic with his diadem on his head in a sumptuous Roman-styled ceremony, as there was still something almost magical and legitimizing about being given a Roman position. With his kingdom of Francia established, his position apparently unassailable thanks to Byzantium, he could now see to solidifying his hold over his people, making it so that there were no alternative kings. Alternative royal lines, which would later bedevil Scottish politics, many other states, were a problem for Clovis, which was why he saw to the killing of Childeric, his former ally, whom he had imprisoned in a monastery, after his failure to support him against Syagrius. In the year 509, he convinced, rather horrifyingly for even the people of that period, Childeric to slay his own father, Clovis's ally, Sigobald le Boiteux, the king of the Ripuarian Franc of Cologne, which the young man did, only to then be tricked by the men sent with him to put his hands deeply into a treasure chest, which they then slammed the lid upon and then proceeded to stab him repeatedly. The son had received, one could say, his due punishment. Not wasting an opportunity, Clovis claimed Sigobald's position as his avenger and convinced that tribe to nominate him their new king, which they did, hapless at first of his little trick. In comparison to this trick, how Clovis dispatched his old comrade, Ragnachal, was an almost boring affair, with the other chieftain taking umbrage with Clovis's conversion, and the two soon quarreled after he denied Clovis access to Cambrai. It could be that Ragnachal actually denied him access because he had foreseen what was likely in store for him. Or perhaps he suspected Clovis of wishing him dead. Or perhaps he didn't wish to bend the knee. Or perhaps he really did take offense at the conversion to the now rising faith of Christianity. We may never know for certain, as it is difficult where to place Ragnachal in the timeline of events. If he was killed closer to 507, he may have quarreled for genuinely religious reasons at the new conversion of his former ally. If after Sigobald's death, then he might have done so for the political and more personal reasons. Either way, his retainers were soon bribed, and he along with his brother were executed, with their corpses handed over to Clovis. The rest of his family were soon hunted down and exterminated. This formidable king, though, had more than a passing interest in his new faith, and shortly before he died, he called a synod in Orléans in 511. This Concile d'Orléans was the first of many kingly and ecclesiastical meetings, wherein they thrashed out agreements and mutually supportive goals for where the Gallic Church should go. At Clovis's first concile, there was a whopping 31 decrees made, on issues ranging from sanctuary to duties of individuals, and a great deal more that I won't bore you with, as this video has already ran over the desired length I originally set out for it to have. The exact date of the by now aged king's passing is uncertain due to conflicting sources. It was either in 511 or 513, but the favorite date seems to be November 27th, 511. After his death, he was buried in the Abbaye de Sainte Geneviève that he had founded in 502, alongside his queen Clotilde. His remains were eventually removed to the Basilique de Saint-Denis in the 18th century. One last story, though. Interestingly, before his death, the old king lamented how he didn't have any living relatives, an obvious ploy to try to rid himself of his last cousins and rivals, if there were any within hearing range, showing that he would die as he had lived, a 5th to 6th century warlord, ever with his eye upon the prize of being the one king of what we could now call Francia. I hope that, though this video showcased the ruthlessness of Clovis, and though there was much discussion of dates and the like, you don't get too bogged down in them, or even condemn Clovis too much. While he was brutal, he was a man who understood what needed to be done to survive, and to keep from being dragged down by others in wrong. This was a brutal, hard period, where only the brutal and clever could survive, and with his seamless ability to blend in with those around him, to rally them. It was rather like a chameleon. In some ways, he reminds me of Augustus, the fascinating founder of the Roman Empire, who had a similar ability of dissimulation and to change with the winds, convincing those who were friends and enemy alike to support him and waste their strength in his name before he conquered them. Though in Clovis's case, he in the end chose to turn his wrath upon his own kin, in marked contrast to Augustus. A greater or more powerful founder France could not have asked for. She also could not have asked for a more driven one. Hopefully this discussion of the fearsome warlord didn't turn you off to this period in history, and you'll join me next time as I discuss the fate of Clovis's 4 sons.